Not much more than a century ago, epidemics of typhoid, cholera, and other fevers decimated cities, towns, villages, whole communities. Then the average life expectancy was brutally short, just 40 years. You were fortunate indeed if you lived beyond childhood. Large families were the only means of ensuring any family at all. Only 100 years ago, human survival depended on this alone. Disease was a mystery, the remedies near witchcraft. Hope lay in fervent prayer, until out of this background of total ignorance of the true causes or nature of infection, there emerged a man whose intuitive belief in a single observation was to change everything.
An experiment with a piece of copper wire and a battery. Now, on his table at the time, there happened to be a magnetized needle. As he connected the wire to the battery, he suddenly saw the needle move. By chance, you may say, but chance only favors the mind that is prepared. That discovery was barely 20 years old before it had its application in the wonders of the electric telegraph. And so, gentlemen, a new idea or discovery is like a child. It awakens hope, but no more. But let it be cultivated, let it grow, and then you will see what it will become.
Louis Pasteur, newly appointed professor of science at Lille University, was the son of a tanner from Arbois in southeastern France. His father, Joseph, was a man of stern moral principle, who every Sunday would proudly pin to his best frock coat the Legion of Honor that he'd won as a former sergeant major in Napoleon's army. From him, Louis derived his patriotism, his simple Christian faith, his belief in discipline and hard work. The old man was immensely proud of him. But not even he, as he walked by himself along the country lanes on Sundays, could have anticipated that before the boy was 30, he too would have been admitted to the Legion of Honor. For by then, young Louis had made important discoveries in chemistry that had put him at once in the forefront of French scientists. Those close to him were expecting even greater things. His wife, Marie, claimed that he would either make no name for himself at all, or one that would rank with none less than Newton or Galileo.
Marie! The council wants us to take on the testing of manures for the entire district.
I hope you refused.
I did not.
But the work it would entail.
If the faculty is to justify itself in the eyes of the community, it must be seen to be of service.
But you have little enough time for your research as it is. Louis, and that's what matters most.
Who's to say that, Marie? Science and the application of science go together. They belong to each other as the fruit to the tree.
It was his strength, and perhaps his weakness, that Pasteur was always so eager to put his knowledge to practical use for the benefit of France. So he came at once when asked by the son of a local manufacturer of alcohol to look into the problems of fermentation.
This bag looks healthy enough.
Yes, sir. An unhealthy one has a grey scum round the top. We're emptying one over here. See, sir? A grey scum round the edge. Typical of a vat going lactic, and the smell completely different. Almost acid.
The manufacture of alcohol by adding yeasts to pulp sugar beet was a long-established process. But from time to time, it went wrong, and no one knew why. At this time, all fermentations were held to be purely chemical processes, despite the fact that in some of them, the yeasts had clearly been seen as minute living organisms.
You can see them quite clearly. Have a look. Can you see some of them budding? That's how they grow and reproduce themselves. That's what causes the fermentation.
But I was always taught that fermentation took place when yeast were dying, not growing.
Yes, that is what the textbooks say. And some chemists, like Liebig, will hear of nothing else, but they're wrong. In fermentation, the yeasts are not dying, but growing.
But the other vats, there's fermentation going on there, even if the wrong sort. And there the yeasts aren't growing.
Ah. But suppose yeast isn't the only thing that causes fermentation. Supposing something else has got into the vats. Something living causes its own fermentation.
Pasteur had noticed beside the yeasts in the bad vats shimmering little rods. It was because chemists like Liebig had not observed them that they argued that lactic fermentation could take place without minute living organisms. It was therefore a purely chemical process, and the presence of yeasts in some fermentation was purely incidental. But Pasteur felt now that he could show that the yeasts and little rods were each entirely responsible, as living organisms, for their own fermentation.
It's gone 11. Well, you'll be back here by 6 in the morning anyway. You must get some sleep.
They're growing and reproducing, Marie. My little organisms are producing lactic acid. As when milk ferments and goes sour. I really can't accept his ideas. Nothing fits them.
Whose ideas?
Liebig's. I'm quite sure he's wrong. It's not just a chemical process. He came nearer to the truth in a lampoon he once wrote than he ever came in his serious writings.
Something Liebig published as a joke?
Yes.
Would I find it funny?
Oh, I don't know that I should tell you. It's slightly indecent.
I find it hard to imagine an indecency of yeast cell.
Well, he had the idea that yeast cells were minute animals, shaped like a distilling apparatus. They eat sugar and eject alcohol from their anus and carbon dioxide from their genitals.
But is that all?
Well, I don't find it altogether seemly or particularly funny. But he could almost be right.
What have you got to do to prove him wrong?
Oh, I'll never prove my case. I must demolish his. I'll publish my work on lactic fermentation. That's the battle to be won first.
Yes. Come on.
I shall read a paper on lactic acid to the Lille Scientific Society. The Academy will have to wait until we get to Paris.
Paris? We're leaving Lille?
Didn't I tell you?
No.
I wrote to Dumas. The École is a shadow of its former self, Marie. I've offered to become Director of Administration and Scientific Studies. There's little doubt that the offer will be accepted.
But with all your work on fermentations.
Well, that needn't be interrupted. If France's premier science college, to which I owe so much, is losing its good name, then the least I can do is offer my services. It's a question of duty.
Duty to whom?
To France, our country.
You have other duties.
This conflict of duties was to dog Pasteur all his life. When he and his family arrived in Paris, they had 3 children by now, he had already published what we recognize today as the first manifesto of the germ theory, a paper demonstrating that when milk went sour, it was not just a chemical process of decomposition, but a change brought about by the action of minute living organisms. In an age when students at the École Normale were taught that chemistry explained all, and men like Liebig held sway, it was a shattering disclosure. Pasteur's next move was eagerly awaited by everyone at the École, especially his old friend and teacher, Professor Biot.
Ah, Deville. Ah, Professor. So, now we have the finest mind in science tucked safely away upstairs.
And yet all they can give him for a laboratory is a couple of rooms in the attic.
Well, I offered to share my laboratory space with him, but he declined. Pasteur prefers to work alone. It's Probably my pipe that put him off. He can't stand smoking.
I suppose they think that since Laurent died from the damp cellar they gave him, they'd better give Pasteur an attic.
They gave him nothing. Pasteur found those rooms himself. Officially, he's not even entitled to a laboratory.
Louis Pasteur?
Well, officially, he's here as Director of Scientific Studies and Administration.
So, you complain about the food. The mutton stew is inedible. When I was a student here, we were grateful for the privilege. We didn't send protests to our elders and betters. Now take note. That stew will be placed on your table every Monday until you learn to show a proper spirit of appreciation. Dismiss. And take that with you.
Discipline, respect for authority. To Pasteur, the ex-sergeant major's son, upholding the social order was a patriotic duty, and patriotism was to colour his whole career. At present, often visited by his mentor, Biot, he was still working to finally discredit Liebig and the chemical theory of fermentation.
They're not dead things breaking down.
To do this, Pasteur was intending to produce fermentation under conditions where his opponents would say it was not possible.
Of course, Liebig still insists that ferments are the breaking down of albumin. So, I've got to show that I can grow a yeast in a liquid that doesn't even contain any albumin. If I succeed, these outdated chemical theories will be finished for good.
If the turning of sugar into alcohol was the result of the breaking down of albumin, as Liebig maintained, and the yeasts just set it off, then it should follow that if there were no albumin to break down, the yeast would do nothing. Pasteur knew this to be wrong. He knew that yeasts would grow and produce fermentation as long as they had something to feed on. So, in his incubator, a small cupboard high up in one of the outhouses, he placed flasks containing no albumin at all, just sugar, ammonia, and some mineral salts, to which specks of yeast had been added. Down at Arbois, his 9-year-old daughter Jeanne was staying with her grandfather, a long way from Louis and his flasks. They were just beginning to harvest the vintage. It was early that year. It had been a good summer. A hot summer. In the village, there'd been 1 or 2 cases of typhoid. Leaving Louis tending his experiments and administrative duties, Marie left Paris and went down to Arbois, where Jeanne had been taken ill. Oblivious of the seriousness of Jeanne's illness and completely preoccupied with discrediting Liebig, he at last experienced success. A flask containing no albumin or organic material to break down had become cloudy, showing that the yeasts had multiplied exactly as he'd hoped they would. The chemical theory of fermentation was disposed of at last. In September 1859, Jeanne died of typhoid. Pasteur wrote to his father.
I cannot keep my thoughts from my poor little girl, so good, so happy in her life, which this fatal year has taken from us. Let us think now of those that remain, and try, as much as lies in our power, to keep from them the bitterness of life.
Now, with a young assistant and a larger laboratory, Pasteur was determined to inquire more deeply into this new order of life. Where did these minute creatures come from? If they could find their way so easily into so many substances, the obvious place to look first was the air. So he and his assistant set up a pump to draw air through the window and trap everything it contained on a wad of gun cotton. The gun cotton would then be dissolved in alcohol and the resulting suspension examined under the microscope. Pasteur was already aware that many other scientists preferred to believe that germs appeared spontaneously, synthesized out of decaying organic matter. This completely undermined Pasteur's belief that germs could one day be controlled. What he saw under his microscope confirmed that they did indeed come from the air. In every sample there were hundreds of organized living bodies. Here were the organisms that, like his yeasts, could transform whatever they fed upon. He was about to demolish yet another of the old guard's bastions.
I understand he's trying to discredit the doctrine of spontaneous generation. It's a maze he'll never find his way out of.
Well, Louis says it's essential that people realize that the lice they see crawling on bad meat have not been spawned by the meat itself, but by other lice.
But every scientist knows that nowadays.
Well, perhaps. But with these almost invisible creatures that Louis has been finding, it's difficult to convince people that these organisms don't just spring into being by themselves, by chance. That's the doctrine that he can't believe.
I advise you to wipe your spoon, Monsieur Biot.
Well, I've lived long enough without ever having done so, my boy. And if I'm carried off now by one of your germs, well, at 82, I shan't have much cause for complaint.
For my part, typhoid could be carried by a germ. Admittedly, most of us seem to have a pretty strong built-in resistance to these organisms. And the chances are remote, sir. But if the 1 in 1,000 has happened to you already, we do not take risks anymore in this family.
Forgive me, I forgot.
Louis, please, shall we talk about something more cheerful?
Yes, all right.
The death of his first child and his anxiety for the others was a constant reminder of the significance his work might one day have.
And there you are. We boil up a broth of organic matter in the flask till the heat has destroyed everything living that it contains.
So it's completely sterile. But the vapor from the boiling does not only sterilize the interior walls, it also forces out the air. Now, if we remove the flame from the flask and allow the liquid to cool,
the vapor condenses and is replaced by air. It will come right through from the red-hot tube, where everything contained in it will have been burned. And when the flask is cold, we cut it off from the rest of the apparatus here and seal it again.
So, we're left with a flask containing air, but air robbed of everything living in it. Will it spontaneously give rise to organisms now? Of course not. That will remain pure for years.
I know, but Louis, it's all been done before. And now Pouchet and the others have come up with a new objection.
What new objection?
When you heat the air, you say you have killed the germs. They say you have killed the life force.
It was seemingly impossible. But how could he devise a way of robbing the air of germs and then allowing it into contact with the broth without interfering with it in any way? Always resourceful, he created, with the help of a colleague and a glassblower, a novel and ingenious form of flask, its neck drawn out like a swan's.
Boil an infusion in that until the germs are killed and the air driven out. Then leave it to cool. No heating this time of the air that has got into it. We don't even need to seal the entrance. Yet, ladies and gentlemen, that flask will remain pure for years. How do you explain that, you partisans of spontaneous generation? Organic matter exposed to ordinary unheated air. Will you say that by boiling the infusion, I have destroyed some mysterious genetic power? If so, let me cut the neck of the flask. There. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I can assure you that in 2 days' time, that liquid will be cloudy. Will you now say that the genetic power has simply been waiting for the swan neck's removal to manifest itself? No. The truth is that before I broke the neck of the flask, the dust from the air was trapped in the curve of the neck here. Remove the curved neck, and you have removed the trap, and the dust now has a clear passage down into the liquid. As a further proof, I'll take another flask containing a similar infusion and shake it so that the liquid now makes contact with the trapped dust, and it too will begin to alter. For if only one tiny organism makes contact with the liquid it needs to feed on, it will multiply rapidly and thus cloud the liquid.
The partisans of spontaneous generation were unimpressed. So Pasteur chose another, more spectacular way to prove his point, that if the air was free of germs, an infusion would suffer no change.
You've got a broken one there, Roland. Send that one back, please.
Yes, Monsieur Pasteur.
With a number of flasks, in each of which some broth had been boiled, the air driven out and then resealed, he set off for the countryside round his hometown of Arbois. He'd already opened some of the flasks in the streets of Paris, and not surprisingly, the broth had soon gone bad after exposure to the city germs. But in the country, the air would be purer, and according to Pasteur's theory, fewer would go bad. Here among the vineyards, the flasks were opened and immediately resealed. Out of 20, 8 remained clear. To prove his case further, he now took his flasks to even purer air. With his assistant and a mule and an Italian guide, he ascended to an alpine glacier. Here he hoped there'd be little contamination from vegetation and little, if any, dust. The climb was not made any easier by the Italian guide's inability to understand French, much less science. He seemed obviously determined to keep as far from these lunatics as possible.
Why must he go so fast? The slightest knock can break those flasks.
Well, he doesn't understand, sir.
What, doesn't he realize what's at stake?
He thinks we're mad.
Be careful, sir! There's a vacuum in every flask! There's a...
Gently, sir. Gently.
All 20 of the flasks had remained intact. Now, in breaking the seal, Pasteur had to be certain that nothing would contaminate them that he or his assistant or the guide had brought there themselves. But here at last, Pasteur was to put to the test his theory that there were places where the air was completely free of germs. If this proves so, it would destroy for good the doctrine of spontaneous generation. For by that doctrine, living matter should arise in his flasks no matter where they were unsealed. In fact, out of 20 flasks, only one, on reopening, was found to be contaminated. But just as this appeared to prove that changes in organic matter could only be produced by the action of germs from the air, Pasteur made the startling discovery that some microbes were of a fundamentally different kind.
Roland, have a look at that, would you? Tell me what you see.
Oh, little rods moving about in chains. Like a string of barges on a river.
Yes. What else do you see?
Oh, nothing that I haven't seen many times before, monsieur.
Look closely at the edge of the drop, where the fluid comes into contact with the air.
The organisms have shriveled up and died.
Now the center of the drop.
They thrive, monsieur.
Well? Those minute animal organisms are living without air. Indeed, air kills them. It's the last link in the chain. They can live anywhere, they can do anything, provided there is no air. Look, dead animals, if left to rot, totally disappear. Even the bones go in the end, devoured by microbes. Deep in the body of a substance, protected from oxygen, they go about their job. That's how it all works.
How what works?
The whole system of creation. Don't you see, Roland? In these infinitely small creatures, God has placed extraordinary powers of decay and destruction. Without them, the world would be filled with garbage. There would be no decay, no change, no life. For everything that is needed for the renewal of life is taken by these tiny animals from the decomposing dead. Is there nothing to be done?
The tumour is very deep-seated.
And you really can't operate?
I'd advise against it in the strongest terms.
But can you?
We can, yes.
Why the devil don't you? It's the only thing left.
Look, if we operate, we may remove the tumour, or most of it at least. But if she doesn't die of shock, she's very weak already. She'll inevitably succumb to blood poisoning. I spent my life diagnosing diseases I've no means of curing by medicine or surgery. We're helpless.
For 6 weeks, Camille's condition continued to worsen. During that time, Pasteur hardly ever left her. Once again, he was discovering that he was still no nearer to understanding the processes of human disease. In the very month that Camille died, September 1865, an epidemic of cholera reached Paris that was soon claiming 200 victims a day. A few weeks earlier, Ignaz Semmelweis had died in Vienna, his theories about germs largely ignored. Treatments were still crude. Ice-wet blankets were wrapped around the patients to reduce fever. And to combat the miasma, the mysterious factor in the air believed to bring on the disease, sulfur was burned. Shocked by his daughter's death, Pasteur turned his attention directly to the cause of disease.
Is this the best that can be done for these poor people? Leeches?
Any better suggestions?
I'm not a doctor. Perhaps I should have been.
how does it spread?
It's a poisonous agent in the air. Must be. Like the ones I find in my fermentations. We must find it and isolate it.
By sucking air from the cholera ward through the ventilator, he hoped to trap the microbe. For just as he was convinced that for every fermentation, a particular microorganism was at work, Pasteur now believed that for every disease, a specific microbe was similarly responsible.
How's it going?
Well, monsieur.
I'll take over for a bit now.
With all the germs from the ward we condense into the tube, how are we going to recognize the cholera germ? Isn't it possible that it's too small to be seen, monsieur?
Yes, it is. But if only we could isolate one organism from the air that's identical to one in the blood of a cholera victim.
Sadly, he was unaware that already an Englishman had observed that water was the key to the transmission of cholera. In any event, just to sort out the myriad organisms they found in the air from the ward was a hopeless task. Defeated here by the complexity of human disease, Pasteur gladly returned to helping French industry. For a time, the diseases of silkworms were to occupy him. But once again, his personal life called him back to his true destiny. His daughter Cecile fell ill with typhoid fever.
Louis. Oh.
How is she?
Save yourself. I fear I dragged you from your work under false pretenses. She's so much recovered.
Dearest Cecile. And all my silkworms so sick in LA's. What a fraud you are.
Take her now, Dr. Pleshwood said she should not exert herself too much.
Oh, come.
Cecile had seemingly recovered, but 2 days later she had a relapse. Like her sister, she was another victim of one of the diseases that Pasteur was still no nearer understanding. It was the fourth death in the family within a few years, for even before Camille's death, his father had died too, proud in the knowledge that his son was becoming a national hero. Not only the vineyards of Arbois, but the whole of French industry was benefiting from his son's studies of the maladies of fermentation.
I thought you were lying down.
I have to be at the academy at 2:30.
But you weren't feeling well. You were shivering at lunch.
It's past. And anyway, if members of the academy are waiting for me to deliver Selwyn Bailey's paper, I can't let them down. They're not progressing very fast down there, are they?
Well, at least they've started.
But I think that they preferred to spend millions on a new opera house rather than on my laboratory.
Well, you got your way in the end. It'll be finished by the spring.
In Germany, they've built palaces for medical studies. The ones in Berlin and Bonn cost 4 millions each. And France
is catching up.
France has not yet begun.
Louis, you're not well.
Curious tingling sensation.
Look, rest this afternoon. I'll send a note to the academy.
I promised Selwyn Bailey I would deliver his paper, and deliver it I will. I'll be back about 5.
When he'd delivered his lecture, Pasteur had returned home tired. At 9 o'clock that evening, after a light dinner, he'd gone early to bed.
Marie! Marie! Marie!
Marie! Oh, look, sit.
I
speak. Certainly the whole of my left side.
I'll get Dr. Goodchild.
I'm afraid there's very little hope.
Dying? Pasteur? I don't believe it.
Hemiplegia. He's paralyzed down the left side, and he's almost lost the power of speech. He comes and goes. One moment he can speak, the next he can't. It's most singular. Paralysis from a stroke is usually instant and complete. I must relieve the pressure. I think 6 should be enough.
Is this the best that can be done for these poor people? Leeches.
Any better suggestions?
I'm not a doctor. Perhaps I should have been.
In my life diagnosing diseases I've no means of curing. By medicine or surgery. We're helpless.
Pasteur's stroke was to leave him partly paralyzed. But it wasn't only his illness that clouded his career at this time. Mentally and physically, he was forced to live quietly. Fermentations were still the only studies in which he achieved practical results, and it was for this work that he was elected by 1 vote in 1873 to the Academy of Medicine. He was by now not the only man to sense a connection between fermentation, putrefaction and disease, but the opposition remained unconvinced.
Every clinician whose experience extends beyond the somewhat limited field of the laboratory bench knows that the disease process is infinitely complex. Every practicing doctor knows that real success in treatment depends on treating the patient, not the disease. Yet Monsieur Vulpian has not the slightest hesitation in attributing typhoid, typhus, tuberculosis, septicemia, all to the name of bacteria. What simple pathology! What startling diagnosis!
Mr. Chairman, may I yet again draw the attention of my esteemed colleague to the results first published by Devane and now confirmed by myself? In a long series of experiments, we injected animals with the blood of other animals who died of disease. Invariably, these animals sickened and died, even though the blood had been diluted to 1 part in 1,000,000.
What does that prove? The blood may well contain germs or whatever you wish to call them, but it might just as well contain something else that is responsible for carrying the disease. Thus to say, as the experimenters do, that by striking dead the bacteria, you can halt the process of a disease is mere fantasy.
I really do protest.
Gentlemen, gentlemen. We're fortunate to have among us the only man who has fully investigated the role of germs on putrefaction and fermentation. I'd like him to give us his opinion.
I hadn't intended to speak, and I haven't studied the diseases that you were discussing. But in all the fermentations that I have studied, lactic acid in milk, butyric acid in butter, and recently that of beer, have been caused by organized living beings.
But disease, monsieur. Disease.
Well, in the case of beer, which is all I can talk of, the correlation between disease and the presence of organisms is certain and indisputable.
Pasteur had made the world aware of microbes. He'd held out the promise of controlling them and conquering disease. But neither he nor anyone else could prove that the microbe, and only the microbe, was the cause of infection. The crucial advance, when it came, did not come from Pasteur or from any of the great centers of learning. In a remote country area of East Prussia, the local doctor was District Medical Officer Robert Koch. His patients were a scattered community of farmers. Their sickness provided him with a modest income, but it was their livestock that interested him most, especially when dead. He had a single consuming interest in one particular disease, anthrax. It was ravaging the district, and year after year it would reappear in the same pastures without any apparent source.
Well, I might as well bury it.
Hardly worth our trouble, Doctor. The trench will be reopened before the night's out and the carcass stolen from me.
Well, before you do, I'll just take that blood sample.
What do you want that for?
It's just a theory I have.
Koch had read that in the blood of sheep killed by anthrax, some weird thread-like organisms always seemed to be present. He had himself found these twisting threads. But were they the killers? Possibly, but it could just as easily be something else in the blood. He decided to find out. His primitive laboratory was a curtained-off corner of his consulting room. His microscope, his wife's birthday gift for her husband's strange hobby. His daughter's pet mice were to be the experimental subjects. Koch was the first to demonstrate their usefulness as laboratory animals, using a sliver of wood to inject them with the disease. Starting with the infected blood of the dead sheep, he began a series of injections, passing the infection from one animal to another. In each passage of the infection, he used the blood of the animal that had previously died. Methodically, he carried out autopsies on each of the dead animals. The blood and body tissue all showed clear symptoms of the disease. The spleen, for example, was always enlarged. But more important for Koch, after as many as 20 consecutive passages, he could always find the twisting threads in the blood and tissue fluids. He noted that these bacilli invariably multiplied. But in essence, Koch had got no further than other researchers. How was he to show that the germ alone caused the disease, when each slide sample showed many other organisms from the dead mice, any of which could have been equally responsible?
It's useless.
Somehow he had to grow the bacilli outside the living animal, in some substance that was absolutely pure and free of other organisms, something the germs could feed on, yet at the same time something transparent, so he could see what was happening.
Emmy!
Can you stay there, Gertrude? Koch was clean on this morning.
Emmy!
Coming. Child, out in the yard chasing chickens. She's becoming a regular gypsy. I'll do my best to keep her clean.
I'm just going down to the butcher's. I shan't be long.
We've got a patient in half an hour. Frau Unradbumst.
Well, she'll just have to wait, won't she?
The mayor's wife?
Well, unless she goes to Breslau, she has no choice.
But she pays.
More blood, is it? No. But the animal must be healthy. an ox or a cow. How can I be sure it's a sound beast?
I wouldn't slaughter it for meat if it weren't. What part of it do you want?
Its eye.
The idea of using the sterile, clear fluid from within an ox's eye was startlingly original. But now, how could it be made to work?
A thin drop of fresh beef aqueous humour is placed in a ground-out hollow on the slide. And seeded at the periphery with infected spleen. A cover slip is placed on the slide, and as a temperature indicator, a drop of tallow is placed on the inner surface. It will melt if the temperature rises to 45 degrees. A temperature of 40 degrees is satisfactory for my experiments. The preparation is sealed with oil to exclude bacteria from the atmosphere, and although there was only a small amount of air in the slide preparation, experience shows that it is adequate. A petroleum lamp is used as a heater, and the microscope placed on a stand just above it. To minimize all temperature changes, the apparatus is shielded from drafts. And observations are made.
Leave those hens alone, Gertrude! That is the third time today I've had to change your frock. Can't you keep yourself clean for 5 minutes?
In the first 2 hours, the bacilli become thicker, then growth begins. After 3 to 4 hours, the bacilli elongate 10 to 20-fold. They then bend and form a network. After several hours, the individual threads appear like a mass of wavy, parallel glass threads. Soon, they form knotted masses, and it is impossible to follow individual threads.
Shall I bring you something in here? You must eat.
No, thank you, dear. I'm not hungry.
After 10 to 20 hours, the contents of the more vigorously growing threads become finely granulated. The granules enlarge and become light-refracting spores.
Spending night after night at his microscope, Koch was to meticulously check these first observations until he knew his drawings traced with enormous detail the entire life history of the bacillus, even revealing the mystery of how it perpetuated itself.
Emmy.
What is it? Well, what's the time?
It's dawn.
Been working all night. You must be tired. I hope it's worth it.
They have spores. It explains almost everything.
The knowledge that the bacilli could give rise to seed-like spores went a long way to explaining the peculiar perniciousness of anthrax. Making use of his new sterile medium, he was able to inoculate animals with the spores alone, free of all other organisms. It invariably produced anthrax. But only after 3 years' repeated experimentation did Koch write to his nearest authority on bacteriology, Ferdinand Kohn, Professor of Botany at Breslau University.
Esteemed Professor, after many failures, I have finally succeeded in elucidating the developmental cycle of Bacillus anthracis. I would be most grateful if you, as our foremost authority on bacteria, would give me your criticism of my work. Since my demonstration material cannot be preserved,
I seek your permission to demonstrate the critical experiments over a period of several days.
He's already here, down in the courtyard, unpacking his material.
Of necessity, I've had to improvise, you understand. These slivers of wood are somewhat unorthodox, but with practice... I tried first behind the ear, but they managed to get the inoculum out. Now, if you care to examine this slide, gentlemen. It shows the spleen of an animal I injected yesterday. You can observe the bacilli in the first stages of their elongation. I'm going to show the entire elongation process, including the moment when the indentations appear and the bacillus is about to divide.
So clear, so pure.
I used the aqueous humour of an ox's eye in a ground-out hollow in the slide. Gentlemen, leave what you're doing and come at once. Gentlemen, come along to Dr. Cole's room. A country doctor, all alone, miles from anywhere. An amazing discovery. You must hear him. Methods all his own, but so exact, so precise. Come along. At still lower temperatures, the formation was correspondingly more languid. Below 18 degrees, sporulation was rare, and there were no spores at all below 15 degrees. Now, this, incidentally, gives us our first practical preventive measure against the disease. Because here, in Germany, soil temperatures at a depth of 8 to 10 meters is below 15 degrees. Thus, burying cadavers in trenches of this depth would lead to the destruction of the bacilli and render the cadavers harmless. Now, after sporulation, the threads disintegrate and the spores sink to the bottom. Now, if you care to examine this slide, gentlemen.
You have shamed us all, Dr. Koch. I consider this the greatest advance yet made in the field of bacteriology.
Indeed. We've all suspected, I know I have, that every disease has its own specific germ. Ever since Pasteur first suggested the idea, but no one has been able to prove it. This work of yours has opened the next door.
Shall I go on, gentlemen?
Go on? Yes, please, Dr. Koch. Do please go on.
Well, having thus eliminated putrefactive bacteria as a possible agent, we're left with the inescapable conclusion that one type of bacillus can produce a specific disease. And this leads us naturally to the next step, which is the conquering of all disease in man.